What do you go for? Go see a show for? Tell the truth, you go to see those beautiful dames. Yes, you spend your dough for bouquets that grow for all those cute and cunning young and beautiful dames. Oh, dames are temporary flames to you, dames. You don't recall their names, do you? What their caresses.
Today, I want to talk about one of the aspects of Hollywood that I find to be most intriguing and the number one area where I feel that the industry has room to grow. And therefore, I think that given the situation the industry is right now, this is where the gaps are going to appear. And that is, to put it quite simply, the difference between A pictures and tent poles. Now, what does that mean? An A picture, which has been the dominant form of Hollywood entertainment, whether feature films, whether television, whether premium cable, whether streaming, has always been primarily driven by the A picture mentality. This also includes B and C films. So then we'll maybe touch on a little bit of that as well. Those are the lower budget versions. But a typical A picture is a movie that has a story that follows the traditional three-part dramatic structure arc. And I know that makes it sound, why are you even talking about that? Isn't it obvious? Apparently not. And the reason I'm saying that is at least since around 2010, and especially after Netflix got started, the role of the A picture was cataclysmically reduced. Instead of being 2/3 of Hollywood's output, with 1/3 being a tentpole movie, it became almost 100% tentpoles and nothing under the A pictures. So let's describe some of the points that are within an A picture. Again, an A picture is one that follows the traditional hero's journey. It follows an emotional storyline, usually where the main character starts out one place, is invited to a challenge, accepts that challenge, goes out of their comfort zone, learns a lesson, comes back, and either succeeds or cataclysmically fails, and then it becomes a tragedy. I think the difference with the way most people perceive what an A picture is that they tie it in with the Greek philosophy of it, not with its actual application. In truth, most of Hollywood has been based on the A picture specifically with a strong female lead. And I know people say, well, what about this? What about that? It doesn't matter. The A picture, by definition, follows on a very story over character orientation, or in many other cases, character over story. But it is the character and their dilemmas that drive most of the action under a traditional A picture. Then what then is a tentpole? A tentpole is a scene-oriented movie. And a scene-oriented movie is one where the scenes themselves dominate. These are the spectacle movies. In many instances, these are the ones that are considered hard genre. Horror, for example, as a prime example of a scene-oriented genre. Note that neither the story nor the characters in the majority of really, really solid horror movies aren't necessarily all that rich and deep. And the stories are more or less cliffhangers that lead you into the spectacular scenes, the brutal murders and all of that. Other genres that fall into that are things like musicals. Because what are most musicals? Now, we can talk about the integrated musical and the Rodgers and Hammerstein style. And yes, that is a part of the musical legacy, but a great chunk of the traditional musical films were always built around setups for songs and songs. And that's kind of it, because again, your characters were often very secondary. Another one is action movies, hard action movies, where you have a lot of adventure scenes. You have characters kind of bark at each other in a really larger than life sort of way. Indiana Jones movies that are a primordial example of that. Old school adventure pictures, Robin Hood, all of that fall into the tentpole side. Now, the tentpole movies tend to be less common. They tend to have a male lead, and they tend to also address audiences on a much younger level in general than the traditional A picture. Now, who's the audience of traditional A pictures? The most common audiences for both movies and TV shows are females 35 plus. And I know there's a lot of people screaming for the saints and fainting, but that's the truth. And it's been that truth for over 100 years. So when people try to mess with that truth, it creates a problem. And one of the challenges that Hollywood has right now is that is precisely the model they have been messing with. I would say, especially since House of Cards debuted, what happened was that the old school traditional A picture was completely set aside. And in its place, you put in increasingly expensive, highly scene oriented movies as well as streaming shows. Note, I'm not talking network here. I'm talking specifically about the majority of early in the streaming world streaming shows. And what that meant was that you had increasingly high budgets. You had increasingly high above the line type personalities in it. And you became completely reliant on the bling rather than the solid content. And the traditional A picture was pretty much shoved aside as something that was not cool, as something that was really not worth making. And I'll tell you a nefarious reason for that. The reason for that is because from the time that Walt Disney Company was able to buy Disney in the mid 90s, the entire industry switched over from being something that was oriented toward A pictures, toward the females 35 plus audience, toward all of that. And it suddenly shifted into everything being about the tent poles. First of all, because the tent poles were something that were easy to understand. You could PowerPoint presentation a tent pole, whereas to discuss why you should do an A picture, it requires a lot more finesse in selling a project. Now, if you had old school development execs, you had old school creative producers, this is not a problem because you had those old school people being able to come in and explain exactly how a project could make money, and the return on investment would be huge. Can you imagine today someone who's in the entertainment industry with a Wall Street background coming in and possibly giving a green light to an ordinary people or a terms of endearment or a Gandhi or any number of more emotionally based movies, unless they had some incredibly large piece of talent attached to them? No, we can't even begin to imagine that. And yet, there were a couple of things that allowed the A picture to be so dominant and get greenlit. And I might be opening a can of words here, but why not? One of the primary reasons for that is the development ranks. A lot of the quote unquote good with story people in the industry, since the very beginning, were either women, often in the form, without getting this kind of credit that men would get, people like Kay Brown. Who was Kay Brown? Kay Brown was David O. Selznick executive. And what was great about Kay Brown is she had a sense for material, and she knew exactly how to get David Selznick to do what she wanted. Of course, her big triumph was when she saw the galleys of Gone with the Wind and said, you got to buy this. And Selznick goes, Civil War movies don't work. And Kay Brown double dog dared him. She said, all right, then, I'm going to go to Jock Whitney and I'm going to have him get the rights for me and I will shop it around. Can we say that that's what made David Selznick buy it? But Kay Brown also knew that the novel Gone with the Wind particularly fit in well with Selznick's style. And that was, what was his main bailiwick? He was able to take classic literature and turn it into very successful box office hits, like David Copperfield, like Tale of Two Cities, so, like Little Woman. He understood what made those stories work. He was an educated man, and he, under Louis B. Mayer, who for a while was his father-in-law, felt that it was their duty to not only make Andy Hardy movies, not only make Test Pilot, not only make these kind of big tentpole type movies, but to also try to raise American culture. One of the big ways that MGM did it, this part wasn't necessarily Selznick, was bringing over stars like Greta Garbo, because they knew, first of all, Greta Garbo would work in Europe. Her movies would sell worldwide in a big way. Maybe not so much in middle America, but certainly in the urban areas and certainly overseas. And so this was Louis B. Mayer saying, I come from no education, but I believe in education. And he tried to make education acceptable for the general audience. And what do I mean by that? I mean that he wasn't saying go to see the movie instead of reading the book, but he wanted people to be aware of what was in those books, even if it was a simplified form. And someone like David Selznick was the perfect person to help with that. And that's why, because David Selznick believed in the word. And I know that there was a lot of controversy between he and Alfred Hitchcock when Hitchcock was first brought over to the US to do Rebecca. And what people forget is when Hitchcock was first coming to America, not only did he not do a direct adaptation of Rebecca, he had a failure called Jamaica's Inn, which was another Daphne du Maurier book. So when that movie failed, Selznick was second guessing himself. So when Hitchcock gave him his initial pages, Selznick flew into a rage because he goes, okay, this guy's really an F up and I made a mistake. But Hitchcock was smart enough to realize what was happening, and he ended up doing much better by Rebecca than even a lot of historians give it credit for right now. But again, these were people who were focused. What is the story? What makes it work? They believed in the primacy of a screenplay, even though Hitchcock was the most tentpole of directors in terms of his actual output. When you look at them, they're often great scenes that are kind of stitched together with stories that are really basic or, in fact, borderline incoherent. But they build properly to the payoff scenes. And that was Hitchcock's trick. And that's why Hitchcock was one of those directors who understood how to play the A versus B picture thing and bring in the qualities of the A picture, even if they weren't emphasized the way they would be in an A picture, into the B. Now, what has happened to Hollywood in the Wall Street Bro era? A big problem is that all of a sudden your female and older moviegoers stopped going regularly. Remember, up until the mid-90s, the definition of someone who was an avid moviegoer would go to see the movies somewhere between, you were considered an avid moviegoer if you went once every 2 weeks. So you were seeing 25 plus movies a year. And of course, then there were real movie fans, like my friends and I were, when we'd see over 100 movies a year. And, be really catty about them and write little essays about them and all that. But that was considered a very, very loyal moviegoer. And that definition has now been dropped almost all the way to someone who goes and sees one movie a month. So somewhere between 12 and 20. This is a big drop. And even though when you listen to a lot of the studio press releases, they're saying it's because audiences have other things they can do. Okay, that's Monday morning quarterbacking. The problem is that you are burning people out on a genre. We are right now at the same place we were when musicals, because of Sound of Music, took over the industry and got increasingly expensive. The musical numbers themselves got increasingly long. And not only that, instead of featuring your main performers, they started featuring way too many extras. Let's take a look at something like Hello Dolly. Two of Hello Dolly's biggest numbers are dancing and the waiters dance in the Harmonium Gardens restaurant. Neither of those feature our main players predominantly, and both of them are endless. So what ended up happening is you got audiences bored. That was also a period when movie running times became excessive. Instead of your average movie being about 105 minutes to 120 minutes, movie lengths were suddenly well over 2 hours into 2.5 hours. And what happened was that these genres worked until they didn't. And you would have successes even when they weren't working as a whole. What's an example of that? 1968. You had a lot of big musicals. Star totally died, almost took down Julie Andrews' career. Thank God she was still in competition with herself with Sound of Music, which played in theaters almost 6 years in its initial run. What else did you have? This was the year after Camelot, which had bombed rather badly. You had Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was a kids movie whose analog today is The Little Mermaid. And what happened with Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Little Mermaid? And yeah, it's very, very reductive to say that the problem with The Little Mermaid was the race swap. That was a minor irritation on YouTube, and it sold it got a lot of people monetization and super chats and all of that. But realistically, what was wrong with The Little Mermaid? Well, there was a lot of things wrong. But the biggest problem with it was that they took an 89-minute animated movie and made it a 135-minute live action. Who was the main audience? Younger girls. Great audience. What's wrong with people who are younger? No patience. So now all of a sudden, a 90-minute movie, which is kind of getting to the outer limits of how long a kid can maintain their attention, had been replaced with a 3-hour and 15-minute version. And going back to my youth, I love Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was really long. So every time I would see it in the theater, I was really into it. I tended to fall asleep in it, and always woke up when the child catcher was there and all that. But I didn't really care about Truly Scrumptious and Dick Van. That stuff was not interesting to me. Same problem with Dr. Dolittle. Boring for the key audience. Because who's the secondary audience? Secondary audience is parents, because parents are bringing the kid. And if you look at a traditional old school Disney movie, 75 minutes for most of their animated movies. If you're a parent and your kids absolutely love it, it's only 75 minutes. And yes, as a parental figure, sitting through 101 Dalmatians 6 times in a row, yeah, you get a little sick of it, but there's enough in it to keep you interested. But if you're going to see a 135-minute Little Mermaid, which is an A picture, if you're going to have a 135-minute Little Mermaid, your key audience for the people that you want to see it on a loop aren't going to love it because it's just too long. There's no excuse for Disney not knowing this. In fact, in 1972, they had this similar problem with Bedknobs and Broomsticks. The original release of Bedknobs and Broomsticks was quite a bit longer than the version that we have available to us now. It underperformed in its roadshow release because it was too long for the kids. Now, I loved Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I was really into witches because of the Wizard of Oz, but that's another story. But when you were watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks, they cut it down a little bit and made it much better. But its lack of performing is indeed one of the many reasons why Angela Lansbury wasn't even considered for the film version of Mame. What I've been trying to say is that where we are in Hollywood right now is not new. What has happened is that there has been a destruction of the A picture in the quest to do these movies that are oriented around blingy things. Why? Because it seems easier to sell the special and not the story. So you end up having movies that have an overabundance of CGI in them. And even though each individual bit might be great, they make the movie too long. Furiosa, 2.5 hours. Why? And I know people are loving it, but they had to have gone and seen it because it's otherwise bombing. It is underperforming relative to Garfield. And it's not because, oh well, men are misogynist and they're pissing off the audience. I mean, they're just being difficult. Guess what? What percentage of Furiosa's audience was male? Can we say 75%? That means only 25% were female. And yet this movie was supposed to be a girl movie. It was supposed to be yet another movie like The Marvels, where you were supposed to bring in those women who had been begging to become action adventure heroes. And instead, these are massive flops. We're more than anticipated in the world of this type of movie. Were male dominated. Can we go back to the original Star Wars? What percentage of that audience was male? Approximately 55%. I mean, 45% was female, right? For a movie that was supposedly so masculine that it's intolerable to think of it now. Look at the numbers. And I know people are saying, Dan, come on, 35 plus? Yes. Let's talk about that 35 plus number. Why? People are talking about, oh, linear TV's dead because the median age in that is over 55. True. What's the youngest the median age has ever been? And I know you're all thinking in your head, somewhere in your late 20s or 30s. The youngest the median age has ever been was in the 70s during the height of the Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, and Welcome Back, Kotter era. It was still 45. Young people have a bad habit between the time of 18 to 34 to be going to college, in certain instances, being in the military, starting their careers, and until very recently, by the time you were 25, you were also married. Usually you got married right out of your college ages. And in many instances, in populations that weren't necessarily college people, you would get married when you were 18, 19, 20, and you would start having kids. Well, you're independent for the first time. Sometimes you're living with your parents, like today, because you don't have money. Yeah, okay, if you're Nepo baby, you have money. And all you went to college for was to marry the right person so that you could merge your family's wealth together or your business needs together. Let's face it, that's what a lot of that networking at Harvard really was about up until, I'm going to say it's still today, but we'll be nice and pretend it's not. And other than that, you were focused on your start of your career when you don't have money. You still have a lot of them in vinegar. You're not cynical yet. And you're meeting someone that you consider spending your life with. Now you have even more options. But ironically, it's become less easy to do this part. But if you have a kid around that age, how old is the kid when you become your mid-30s? What are they doing? You're right. First of all, your career is more stable, hopefully. Secondly, you have done all of the crazy, wild stuff you ever dreamed of doing. At least in my generation. If you didn't stay out every night until about 2 a.m. in the morning and then roll into work at 9, work a whole day and repeat, that was normal. So how much time did you actually have to go to movies? Again, I was a geek, so obviously I was going to do different. Watch TV or any of the rest of that. You really didn't. But all of a sudden, you're in your mid-30s, and depending on when you had your first child, they're starting to go to high school. And what happens when they go to high school? They don't want nothing to do with mom and dad anymore, right? So what ends up happening is for the first time, you can almost take a breath. In the second place, and this is old school, if your kid is out for a date, you're sitting there watching the TV, clawing the armrest of your sofa because they are 1 minute late in getting back. And the fact that the news reports it's 10 p.m., do you know where your children are? You go, they better be back here because they're now 1 minute late. See? So during that, you have an incredible increase in the TV viewing. You have the money to where you could afford cable and video cassettes and all the other additions. You could buy a computer. All of this was something that would happen between the ages of 18 to 34. And so during that period, you're really not devoted to TV unless it's your career or unless it's a very serious hobby for you, and then you come back in. That is why those demographics have never changed. Because today, yeah, you might not have the kids, but you are career focused. So this is what happens. Now, what was the consequence of this? The consequence of this was by ignoring Hollywood history, there was incredible trouble that happened in the highest of the highest ends. If you look at older movies from the 1930s, or the 1920s, Mary Pickford, Lillian Gish, massive stars, one of whom was Hollywood's first executive. She was part owner of United Artists in the 1920s. So stop it with women never had positions of power in Hollywood. And then you get into you started having transgressive females as the lead. They weren't called transgressives then, but they were women who were outside the norm, who fulfilled a certain amount of fantasy, whether it be Joan Crawford, who in real life had been from an incredibly abused background and had come up from grinding poverty, and suddenly in 1932 had become the epitome of the shop girl made good, someone who used her pluck, used her assertiveness, used her natural sexual magnetism to move herself forward in her career. Or you had someone like Mae West.
I see a man in your life.
What, only one?
Who caused the production code to come in, because here was a woman who didn't look at sex as worse than death. She embraced it. And not only did she embrace it, she talked about it. Katharine Hepburn, someone who was very mannish in her presentation, very charismatic, very much someone that people would admire. But she wasn't your girl next door. She wasn't a shop girl made good. She gave off this air of being someone who had a little bit of pluck and a little bit of money, but was able to take it and carry it beyond its normal limitations. How about Marlene Dietrich coming over from Europe and in Morocco, coming out in a man's tuxedo, kissing another woman on the lips, and then taking the flower that she took the woman and throwing it to Gary Cooper in the audience, indicating her own ambiguous sexual persona. Plus, Marlene Dietrich in that tuxedo created a fashion sensation, followed by Claudette Colbert, followed by Katharine Hepburn, a woman wearing slacks, which became a national obsession. Marilyn Monroe, look at what Marilyn Monroe was. I hated Blonde because Blonde positioned her as a victim, and Marilyn Monroe was anything but. Yeah, she had insanity running her family. That was sad, and that did cause her a lot of trouble later. But she was no victim. She's in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She says it's called Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I'm the blonde. Where's my money? Darryl Zanuck says, we're not going to pay you. She goes to New York, joins the Actors Studio, says, I'm not coming back to Hollywood. I'm going to become a real actress. Can we say she got more money than she had asked for? Then there's the Ella Fitzgerald thing, that Ella Fitzgerald was going to perform in a club, but the club was still restricted. Marilyn Monroe said to the guy who ran the club, I will show up every night dressed to the nines that she performs. You will be a sellout, and Ella will have a career. To her dying day, Ella Fitzgerald would credit Marilyn Monroe for helping her break that barrier. Elizabeth Taylor, 14 years old. Louis B. Mayer's yelling at she and her mother. Mrs. Taylor said, okay, you know what? We'll just go back to England. We don't need this Hollywood stuff. We're not going to put up with you. To Louis B. Mayer. Elizabeth Taylor says, F you, Mr. Mayer. 14-year-old Liz. Can we say her stardom was assured? Yes, she did marry Nicky Hilton in order to get away from too many people trying to paw her. She wasn't dumb. Yes, she did cause a problem with Debbie Reynolds when she ran off with Eddie Fisher after her husband, Mike Todd, was killed in a plane crash. They remained good friends at the end of their lives. They more than made up. She was the first person to get paid $1 million a picture. Actually, $7 million, because 20th Century Fox really blew the budget on Cleopatra. Setting the stage for all the male actors who followed. And by the way, who has been the follow-up female performer who set a new salary standard for everyone? Can we say there's been no one? This was a Hollywood that understood the power of the female star. George Cukor famously said, Hollywood says it's about tough men and pretty women. It's actually about the opposite. And he was right. Who are your biggest stars? Now, okay, I'm going to show my age. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Timothée Chalamet. Pretty decorative men. Who are our biggest female stars? Again, showing my age. Jennifer Lawrence. You believe her in Hunger Games, right? Gal Gadot in the first Wonder Woman, right? She's supporting less able men. Going back a step, Meryl Streep, Susan Sarandon. None of these women are traditionally beautiful, but they are powerhouses and people go to see them. The lack of properly building female stars is the reason that Hollywood is in trouble right now. And you can say, oh, but look at these stars we've made. What have you done with them? You take a star and put them in a male skewing movie. And you make them the quote unquote Mary Sue, where they don't have to go through any training. They're just born with the talent. They are just girl bosses. There is nothing about them that has to learn anything. They are smarter than every man. They rescue men. They beat up men who are much taller and much larger than they are. And they don't ever have a struggle. That doesn't work. That doesn't work in any A picture. So what they've done is they've shoehorned female actors into male roles that they do not fit properly. And then you'll hear people go, oh, but what about Sigourney Weaver? What about Linda Hamilton? What about Jodie Foster? What about them? What movies did they break through in? Alien. What's Alien? Alien is scene-oriented. It is a haunted house movie. What else is it? It's an A picture. We know those characters. Those characters all have arcs. What is Sigourney Weaver's role in Alien? She doesn't start as a boss babe. She starts as someone who is unpleasant and too by the books. When John Hurt has the face hugger on his face, she refuses to let him in. And Dallas, the leader, and Ash, the technical guy, overrides her. And she was right. Dallas realizes, Tom Skerritt character, the commander of the ship, realizes he's an F-up. So he commits suicide so that she can take the leadership without him having to besmirch his ego by handing the reins of power to a woman. How do we know he did that? What the heck is the commander of the ship being the one who puts himself in direct danger of being in the path of the alien? He knew what he was doing. He was being deliberately self-destructive. Now let's look at Terminator. A picture. Lots of action in the first one, right? Low budget. Because it's low budget, you have to get people interested in the characters. You have a woman who cannot rub two nickels together and make a dime. And yet she's got to kill this massive thing. She is feeling completely insecure. And she does it anyway. And then we get to Terminator 2, and we see her having flaws. What's her biggest flaw? That she has to overcome her fear of looking at the person who tried to kill her and saying, he's now on my side. She has to show her mothering instinct. Very big individual character change in the middle of all this spectacle around it. How about Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs? Silence of the Lambs, yes, it's a horror movie, so it has a lot of key scenes set up. And you notice its structure is that way because the Hannibal Lecter character is really irrelevant to the actual narrative in the story. He's kind of a fringe figure. But his relationship with Jodie Foster, testing her, pushing her, reminding her of her weaknesses, forcing her to embrace it. That's the character stuff. That's her development. How is she depicted at the beginning? She's in the elevator with all the men. They're all taller than she is. But yet, when push comes to shove, she has the inner resource, but she's not a boss babe. She gets guided there, and she is indeed scared when she's in the house and she can't see. And Buffalo Bill is behind her watching her through infrared glasses. But she's aware. And ultimately, she does triumph over Hannibal Lecter simply by surviving. A pictures disguised as tentpoles. That's why when people refer to them, they refer to the same ones. How many people refer to Life Force instead? No one, right? How many people really refer to many action movies outside of this very specific, rather small cadre? Now, let's talk about how this has manifested itself recently. Not only with Furiosa, because I think Furiosa was badly marketed, but there's another movie that was badly marketed and shouldn't have failed the way it did. Let's talk about The Fall Guy. What is there about The Fall Guy that is such a screw up? Just looking at the advertising of it, the trailer and the poster. The poster is the worst example. What's in the poster? You have Ryan Gosling in a tank top shirt showing his beefiness, and you have Emily Blunt standing behind him. Why does that image work for no one? It's a romantic comedy action adventure. When we look at that image, we have Emily Blunt being positioned as a boss babe. She has an arm possessively over Ryan Gosling's shoulder. So she's in power. He's merely the muscle guy. He's merely decorative. Now, I suspect that in the boardrooms, they were discussing it and wanting to keep the same power dynamic that was in Barbie. That was a mistake. Instead, they needed to highlight Ryan Gosling as being someone you could trust. In the second ad, which is even more of a disaster, you have Emily Blunt in the car yelling out the window. You can't even tell it's her. If you're looking at pictures very quickly as you're scrolling through your Instagram feed, you wouldn't catch that. And Ryan Gosling is hanging down doing his stunt. But when we look at it, we're not sure what he's doing. We don't get the sense of action adventure. Now, let's look to 40 years ago. I know I'm an old guy, so I'm going to have that as my imprint. Look at the ad for Romancing the Stone. That ad tells you everything you need to know. That movie was a massive hit, and it basically is not that different in story in terms of the basic themes from The Stuntman. What do you see in it? You see Michael Douglas acting heroic. Now, this was a step outside of his comfort zone at that point. Michael Douglas was getting a little bit long in the tooth. So having him play an action hero, people look at it and go, really? And then and of course, it reignited his career. And then we have Kathleen Turner coming off of Body Heat. So there's an audience knowledge that she is someone who's strong, someone who's nefarious, someone who is morally ambiguous. She's looking scared. So that knowledge that she's someone who we've already seen bring down William Hurt is acting like she needs Michael Douglas to rescue her. So you have both actors outside of their comfort zones at that moment. And that makes an audience go, wow, there's something about this that I'm not expecting, because these are stars I know, these are stars I like. They're slightly out of their comfort zones. And then you see the previews for it, full of action. You see the and also humor. Humor that's delicately prickly toward the actors' perceived personalities. The ad for the Fall Guy is confusing. Is it a romantic comedy? Is it an action movie? What is it? It's not clear. So, what is the solution that I'm proposing? The solution I'm proposing is that Hollywood needs to go back to doing 2/3 A pictures, 1/3 tent poles, not 90% tent poles where you just happen to cast to make it look like an A picture. No, they are not similar movies. So stop trying to conflate them. And cut the budgets. The budgets are out of control. The big reason PowerPoint boys and girls don't like A pictures is you have to have a good script. You have to have a good story. You can't shoot the whole thing, look at the rough assembly, and rewrite it on the spot the way you can with a tent pole. We also don't have the money to do that anymore, quite frankly. So that means you got to do it right the first time. And that means you write scripts. You're going to do a star vehicle, make it about the star, not about the CGI. Allow the actors to carry you. The actors are the ones who will pull you through it. And I actually think the actors will be, like they were in the 80s and 90s, willing to work below their normal rates in order to be in something that allows them to try something different. And that's the way you fix it. It's going back to the roots of showbiz. Don't disregard the past. Use it as a lesson. Today, how do you incorporate TikTok without necessarily bringing TikTok in? How do you incorporate the YouTube audience without necessarily stealing people from YouTube? That's the challenge. Because what do YouTube and TikTok do? They bring people in with common people, not necessarily movie stars. Yes, you do have those Mr. Beast performers. You do have the crazy people like the Paul brothers, but you don't. You're still connecting mostly on average people who tell stories that average people relate to. What's missing? That. Write good stories.
As I was telling all those gentlemen a while ago that what do we go for? Go see a show for, tell the truth, we go to see you beautiful day.